Right. Wonderful. All right. It's top of the hour, so let's get started. Good afternoon, and welcome to Georgia DNR's Lunch and Learn webinar. I'm Emily Wingo, the Georgia DNR Floodplain Unit. First, a little housekeeping. We are in listen-only mode, so please make sure your mics are muted. If you're having any Wi-Fi issues, you may want to turn off your camera and any other programs you have running. Please make note of the chat feature on your screen. Please use the chat for communication, as we will not be taking questions by audio. Aaron Kyle of Dewberry is monitoring the chat and will try to help you with any technical matters. We are offering 1 hour of continuing education credit for CFMs. To receive the credit, you must be logged in separately, answer all poll questions during this session, and provide your name and email at the end of the presentation. Please use the radio buttons to respond to the poll questions in either the pop-up window or the chat box. A copy of the presentation will be emailed to all attendees. Also, a survey link will be provided at the end of the presentation. We appreciate you completing the survey so that we may improve these webinars in the future. We are recording today's webinar and plan to post the video onto georgiadfirm.com. And with that, let's get started on today's presentation, Elevation Certificate, Change in the Form, and the GAFM EC Guidebook. Our presenter is Del Schwalz, president of Schwalz Consulting, LCC. Del Schwalz is an environmental engineer with 23 years of experience in floodplain management and water resources. He provides engineering and floodplain management solutions for local communities, state and federal agencies, and private entities. He specializes in conducting training around the country on the FEMA Elevation Certificate, supporting communities in improving their CRS and overall floodplain management programs, and tailoring local regulations to meet the community's specific needs and goals. Mr. Schwalz also serves as the expert legal witness on FEMA regulations and programs and has been the H&H inland flooding subject matter expert for the Florida Commission on Hurricane Loss Projection Methodology since 2015. His background includes watershed and stormwater management, independent technical reviews of FEMA flood risk projects, and flood insurance studies, HMA grants, and flood risk assessment, modeling, and mapping. Mr. Schwalz has been on the board of directors for the Florida Flood Managers Association since 2008, including serving as chair and vice chair and serving as Region 4 director on ASFBM board from 2016 to 2022. He is a PE in Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina, and earned his CFM in 2003. And with that, I'll turn it over to Del.
Thanks, Emily. I appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning, or this afternoon now. Also, as another plug, in case you didn't hear, I am a Georgia boy. I'm from Moultrie, Georgia. Go Pack. And so I live in Orlando now, but I am a local Georgia native. So today we're going to get started with looking at the new elevation certificate and walk through the changes and the updates that have occurred between the old form and the new form. And then we're going to talk about the GAFM EC tool that's being developed. I'll walk through both of those, and hopefully we'll have some time for some questions and be able to really roll around in the nuances. So here's my contact information. As Emily said, I'm on the board of directors for the Florida Floodplain Managers Association. I'm also an associate on the ASFPM Foundation. And if you're not familiar with the ASFPM Foundation, it's a nonprofit a partner of ASFPM that raises money to provide scholarships for upcoming juniors and seniors who are pursuing tracks in floodplain management, as well as raising money for floodplain management projects that actually change the direction of floodplain management on a national level. And we'll circle back to that a little bit later because that's going to come up in our topics. Here's my contact information. If you got any questions, you can feel free to reach out to me. DS at Schwalz Consulting, and then usfloods.com. So the elevation certificate, we have a brand new edition. It's the 2023 edition. And this is really important to note because when FEMA issued the first version, it said 2022. And so if you've got the EC downloaded, if it doesn't say 2023, you've got the broken old version of the form. So you need to re-download the form and get the latest and greatest version. And that latest version was published in the fall. It corrected some of the functionality issues with the EC. So make sure you've got the latest and greatest. So this new form is pretty much laid out exactly like it's been before. There's nothing really new. A and B is on a page, C and D is on a page, E and F and G, and everything's laid out the same way as it was before, except we have one new page. We have section H and I that's been added, but everything looks the same. FEMA didn't change the format of the EC other than adding some fields here and there, because the format really got fixed well after the 2015 kind of, I don't know if the debacle is the right word, but when the legal version of the form came out, it wasn't exactly user friendly. And so by the time we got done and the dust settled, the format of the form was really very user friendly. And so they kept that, which I think is a good thing. Now, the changes in the elevator certificate, first thing I want to talk about is why did it change so much? Well, we had the 2019 version of the form that came out, and then the 2023 edition came out. So why did it change? Well, when the original form came out back in 2015, as I mentioned, it was the legal size version of the form. There's a lot of problems with it, and a lot of people complained, and then so afterwards, ASFPM pulled together a task force and said, hey, FEMA, before you issue a new form, why don't you let us help you fix it? And that'll probably remove some of the consternation. So FEMA said, great, and pulled together a task force. Bruce Bender was part of that through the ASFPM Insurance Committee, pulled together experts from around the nation to really look at what needed to change in the EC and why. Basically, we pulled in all of your input from years of training and shredded the EC and put it back together. Well, then in 2018, the government shut down and all these issues happened. So we actually didn't get to roll it out in the 2019 edition. So 2019 was basically a rubber stamp of the previous version. So then FEMA pulled together the task force again. And before the 2023 edition got pulled out, we were able to create this brand new form. And so today we're going to be comparing, I've created a comparison document here, and we're going to be walking through that comparison document to show what has changed between the 2019 and the 2023 edition. You can download this comparison document at flfloods.org/resources, and that's the FFMA website. So the Florida chapter, that's the sister chapter of GAFM. That's our website there. So you can download the comparison document and any supporting information that we have as far as memos from FEMA that said when things are changing. The draft flood proofing certificates are there as well. And you can download the current EC. So if you have any questions, let me know, but everything's available at that website. Now, I will mention, when you download the new elevation certificate from FEMA's website, you will get errors, or if you get an error that says your PDF viewer is out of date, it means you're doing it wrong. So FEMA's new EC, the 2023 edition, can only be viewed using Adobe software. I've had some people who have managed to be able to figure out how to open it with Bluebeam and some other ways, but in general, Adobe software is the only way you can access it. So when you download it, if you open it in your browser, you'll get the error message of your PDF viewer is out of date. So what you actually have to do is save that document to your computer and open it up from there. However, if you click download and a window pops up and you click that, it's going to reopen it in your browser and you'll get the error message again. So I've had so many people call me and say, I promise you I'm doing it right, but I get the error message still. No, you're not. If you get the error message, you are opening it in a browser, period. You got to download it to your computer and open it just like you would a Word document or an Excel file. If your computer is set to open Adobe files in a browser, it's also going to mess up. So if you're having the error, you're doing it wrong, I promise you. So you got to make sure you download it correctly. But once that's, like I said, it's available for download at the flfloods.org page. But once again, if you download it there in your browser, you're going to get the error message. So a lot has changed on this form. Here's the comparison document I created. Everything that's blue is new text, red is stricken. As you can see, there's a lot of blue and red text here on the instructions and the form. As we walk through, tons of red and blue in here. So much has changed. But one of the biggest things I hear from surveyors is even though it looks like a lot has changed, not much has changed. because really all of these edits are FEMA catching up with how we've been doing most of it anyway, and a lot of rearranging of the text, getting things streamlined, taking sections that were pressed together and pulling them apart into individual items and fields for the form. So most of the changes are just editorial, cleaning up the language, whereas the impact of what we're actually doing is not changing that much. So go through and you can look through this document and see exactly what's changed. In here, if it went from and to or 1 to 2, it's identified in here in detail. So you can make sure you see exactly what has changed, what's been added and taken out. But so let's look at the reality of what the changes are actually causing and the impact of that for our daily completing in the ECs. So here's section A. In general, like I said, not a lot has changed. For our horizontal datum, A5, we have a brand new datum, WGS 84. And as we go through these slides, anything in green is what has actually changed. If the text is in white, it means it's the same thing we were doing before. So we have a brand new datum, WGS 84. This is really helpful because Google Earth and a lot of other data sources are in WGS 84. Previously, we had NAD 27 and 83 only, which means if you were using Google Earth, you'd have to convert that latitude and longitude into one of those datums. So now we have WGS 84, which is going to make life a lot simpler. Also, photographs are now mandatory for all purposes. Under the previous EC, photographs were required for insurance, but we really stressed the importance of having them for everything. Now they're mandatory because FEMA agreed that we really need pictures for floodplain management and really any purpose for the EC. Regarding our crawl spaces, enclosures, and attached garages, A8 and A9, this is the section that probably changed the most in the new EC as far as how we complete it. Right off the bat, we have a brand new question. Are there openings on multiple walls? So if you look at the FEMA regulations, if I have an enclosure below the main floor that's parking, storage, or access, or an attached garage, the FEMA regulations require there to be at least 2 openings, but it doesn't require them to be on multiple walls. However, the building code does, and insurance only gives credit if the openings are on multiple walls. So there wasn't really a spot to put that on the form before. So that's why this question got added, because it's a really important question for compliance with the building code and to document the insurance that your flood openings are insurance compliant. So that's a new question. In addition, the engineered and non-engineered opening debacle, I guess you could say, where everything was just in one bucket, has been cleaned up. This makes things a lot easier. Now we have separate fields for engineered and non-engineered. So there's no longer a question about, which one is it, how many is it, how many what's the rated area, what do you put in the field? It's really streamlined that entry is making life a lot simpler, both for the surveyors completing it and you as a community official reviewing it and insurance agents. And the whole process is made a lot simpler by these fields being separated. In addition, we have the engineered and non-engineered areas have been separated. So C is the number of openings. We've separated those. And then D is the non-engineered area. So how much opening do you have? And for example, if I have 100 square inches of opening and half of it's blocked by screens and louvers, that's 50 square inches. So that goes in D. This is for the non-engineered area only. And then the rated area of the engineered opening goes in E. So they're separate. So if I have a flood flap or a smart vent or a freedom vent, any of those national manufacturers, their rated area goes in E. Whereas if I have some non-engineered openings, those go in D. So it makes life a lot simpler, separates those out so we don't have to mess with the confusion of who put what where anymore. And then F is the rated area, adding those together. So for non-engineered, if it's a square inch of opening, it's rated for a square foot of enclosure. And so we just add D plus E to get F. One thing to note, A lot of people are getting confused by that addition because they're taking D, which is in square inches, and trying to convert it to square feet. Don't do that. You're overly complicating it. There's an example in the instructions. All you do is take the number in D and the number in E and add them together to get F, because the square inches in D are rated for the same number of square feet. So don't overly complicate it. If it's confusing, you are trying to do unit conversion. It's a lot simpler than you're trying to make it. So D plus E is equal to F. Now, one thing to note is that for the rated area, FEMA has changed the requirements. Previously, the instructions said for engineered openings, attach the certification if you have it. Well, FEMA got rid of the if you have it. Now it's mandatory. So if you have an engineered opening, which if you're not familiar, an engineered opening is one of those openings that if we have 1,000 square foot garage, we need 1,000 square inches of opening. And that's the 1-to-1 ratio, so we don't have to do the math. An engineered opening is where somebody's done the math for us, and they have determined through engineering analysis and calculations, testing in a lab, that although if we have 1,000 square foot garage and we need 1,000 square inches, we can get by with 462. That's going to be sufficient to equalize the pressure. It's not some magic hole that moves more water than another hole. It's somebody has done the engineering analysis for us, so the 1-to-1 factor of safety is not needed anymore. But if that is being used, an engineering certification is mandatory. So there's either been an ICCES, national certification, or an individual engineering opening certification for that specific product. And FEMA has said, if you don't attach those certifications to the EC, it doesn't count as engineered. And this is a really big deal because for most engineered openings, when it's dry, when there's no floodwaters, they're closed. And then when the floodwaters come, they open up. For a non-engineered opening, you get credit for how much area that there is during normal times. So if my engineered opening is closed normally and I don't have the certification, it counts as non-engineered, which means it counts as 0 credit. So you've got to attach the certification. There's no more of this, go get it offline or go find it. You've got to attach it. And I think it's going to make things a little more difficult for some surveyors, but it's also going to protect the surveyors better, because there were times where a surveyor might say it's engineered because somebody told them, and then later it turns out it was an engineered opening, and so whose liability is there? And so this just cleans it up. It puts the liability on the person who designed it. Surveyors, all you're doing is counting. You're not certifying these engineered openings. You're saying there's 6 of them, and you're attaching the certification from somebody else. So it removes that liability piece. But this is a really big change in the program and in the EC instructions that folks need to be aware of. And I've had some growing pains. A lot of surveyors and communities are being slow to require this, even though it's been mandatory since July. So that's the biggest change. And as you'll note, there's on the form, the word color is highlighted. That is one of the only changes from the 2022 edition to the 2023. When FEMA fixed the functionality between the broken version and the new version, they made a couple of edits to text, one typo and adding the word color there because they were oversights from before. And because the text changed, that's why we have the 2022 to the 2023 edition. So it doesn't actually affect anything, but I just want to note that that's one of the 2 text changes, and we'll see the other ones in this most recent updated version. Now, Section B really didn't change at all. It's very minimal changes. Mostly it's just instructions being cleaned up. The first one is B1A and B. So now the NFIP community name and number have been split. Bill Neckerman from New York really wanted that to be added. And it's going to make life a lot easier because so many surveyors were leaving out one of these options. It's not either or, it's both. So to make it very clear, we made it 2 fields. So now blank field, it's a lot clearer that it's an error rather than putting something there and forgetting the other half of the information. B13, this is our new field, the limit of moderate wave action. So for you coastal folks, these zones are 3 feet of waves or higher. The coastway, the LMWA, designates the area where the waves are 1.5 to 3 feet. It's not a regulatory zone on FEMA's flood maps. It's just identified there, but it is a regulatory zone for the building code and a lot of local municipalities. So it's a really critical piece of information. We can thank Lisa Foster from Pinellas County, Florida for this. She was on the committee. We asked FEMA to add the LIMWA to this form during our 18 months of working with them, and they kept saying no. And they said no 1,000 times. And then at like 5 minutes left to go before everything was done, the 11th hour, Lisa wanted us to ask one more time. We went back and forth. No, we're not going to ask. We finally said, hey, FEMA, can we have LIMWA? And they said, sure. So persistence paid off. And it's a really important piece of information, especially for documenting compliance at the local level in your coastal areas where you've got the coastalway zones in the building code adopted. But that's it. Nothing else changed. Everything else is pretty much instructions that have been tweaked and adjusted. Section C and D, once again, not much has changed. Most of the edits here were just taking the A, B, C, and D instructions and splitting them apart into separate instructions, because before they were all in one paragraph, and some folks got confused about, does this relate to C or D? And so we streamlined it a little bit and clarified the instructions for the most part. So the big change is the datum conversion checkbox is now there. So previously, if you collected the survey data in a datum that was different than the flood map. So let's say your flood map's in NGVD 29 and the survey was collected in NAVD 88. Well, you had to convert the survey data into the same datum as the BFE before it was entered into the form. And sometimes that happened, sometimes it didn't, but there wasn't a spot for the surveyor to acknowledge it right here in this section. And because it got overlooked so often, FEMA wanted to add this checkbox directly above the survey data. So when you go from identifying your benchmark in your survey collection process to the elevations, there's a line in between that is yelling at you that you've got to do the conversion. So the conversion was always required, but now there's a checkbox. C2, F, and G, this one was always a point of consternation and confusion. So now we have to specify whether it's natural or finished grade that is your lowest adjacent grade and highest adjacent grade to the building. And this is really important because it's always finished construction, finished grade, except for a zone AO. And for zone AOs, this must be natural grade. But it was so often overlooked because there wasn't anything indicating it here. And a surveyor would get done and maybe forget it, not even be aware of it. And so it created a lot of confusion and problems. So having a box here that you have to check, and it is mandatory to check it, whether it's a zone AO or not, really clarifies and keeps that natural grade piece from being missed in a zone AO. Because natural grade has to be completed here for the zone AO for LOMAs and LOMA RFs and to help document the compliance. And then we have an email box. May seem like a small thing, but it's a really critical piece of information for the EC certifier, and it only took us till 2023 to get a box for the email. But those are the only changes in section C and D. Everything else is just clarifying information that was already required and making sure it's not overlooked. For E and F, this is the section that was both zone A and zone AO, and this was the insurance section. And so mostly the only changes here were pulling the insurance information out. So we did add a construction status box though. In section C, you had to check whether it was construction drawings, building under construction, or finished construction. And that was missing in section E. So that got added. So that is a brand new field. And then the natural grade requirement actually got flipped upside down. So previously, if you were completing this section for zone AO and a zone A with no BFE, you had to use natural grade. But so often it was ignored, and the requirement was to tell me how you came up with natural grade in this section. Well, because that wasn't getting us the information we needed, FEMA flipped it and said, all right, natural grade's mandatory. If you don't use natural grade, explain yourself. And so it inverts the requirement here, because FEMA really wants people to push the determination of natural grade, because so often people are just like, I don't know, it's fine, here's constructed grade. So now you have to explain why you didn't use natural grade. And if your answer to I didn't use natural grade is I couldn't find it, that's not going to carry a lot of weight with FEMA, because there are ways to, if you've got a pre-existing survey, you can use that, but there are ways to estimate it even if you can't find it. Is there historic quad maps? Is there historic LIDAR or topography data? Do you have a closest natural tree line that you can estimate the natural grade, which natural grade is the grade of the ground before any fill was placed or excavation occurred. So there's ways to ballpark it even if you can't be exact. And so FEMA is really pushing that you've got to give a good effort to determine this natural grade. And I couldn't find it usually means I didn't look. So that's what FEMA is trying to push back here. And then the biggest change is all of the insurance information from Section E has been pulled out and put in Section H and I. And there is a little bit of shrapnel left over. I will admit, if you look in the Section E instructions, sometimes there's a little bit of leftovers. The homeowner being to fill it out, those kind of sections are still more related to insurance. So just be aware as you're reading through sections E and F and the instructions, if something sounds odd, it's probably shrapnel from removing the insurance and some leftover stuff that we'll have to clean up next time. But it's very minor if there's anything at all. So that's section E and F. Sections H and I, this is a brand new section. And yes, I skipped G. I'm going to come back to G, but I want to go from E and F, where the insurance information was pulled out, and go to the section where it was placed. So sections H and I, this is our brand new insurance section. This was brought about for risk rating 2.0. And so, as I mentioned, the biggest change is that all the insurance information, the use and the data was in E and F, and now it's in H and I. And it can be completed by a homeowner. And note that that is not in green. A homeowner could complete sections E and F for insurance, and now they can do the same thing for H and I. And people get concerned, well, what if the homeowner lies? Well, that's insurance fraud. So FEMA's not too concerned about the homeowner misrepresenting the data, because if they do, it will come out in the wash when the insurance claims happen. Now, I am going to mention a little bit of the why for risk rating 2.0 and why we have this new section, so you understand why we're completing this. Now, this is not a time for you to tell me what you don't like about risk rating 2.0. I know what you don't like about it, but I want to give you a little bit of information and context so you understand that when somebody asks you to fill this out, and that's community officials or surveyors, you understand why you're doing it. So risk rating 2.0, that is the change. It's the new rating system for FEMA for flood insurance. It's what FEMA could change under the current regulations. So that's why they made this change, because that's what they could do without changing the law. And whereas before, under the old rating system, you were either in the flood zone or out of the flood zone. And note, I said flood zone, not flood plain, because a flood plain is a natural area that gets wet when it rains. A flood zone is an area identified on a map that has regulatory implications, and they are not the same thing. So previously, you were either in the flood zone, I'm in the AE zone, and I'm paying $2,500 a year in flood insurance, or I step 6 feet to the right, and I'm in the X zone, and now my flood insurance is $800. That in versus out approach isn't, it's not consistent with the way the private flood insurance market's been doing it. It's not actuarially sound, which means you charge enough for insurance to pay the claims. Same reason why smokers have to pay more for health insurance. Same reason why at-risk drivers have to pay more for car insurance. And so it wasn't actuarially sound. And it didn't actually reflect the risk of the property. So in risk rating 2.0, now it's no longer in versus out. It's what is your overall risk of flooding, not based on the 100-year flood, but the 500, the 1 day, the 1 year, the 10,000-year flood, all the flooding risk based on all the data we have. The modeling companies, the big catastrophe modeling companies, generate very large data set, and they look at all the possible flooding and run a 50,000 year, 100,000 year simulation to look at all the different nuances. Is the ground wet? Is it dry when it rains? What's going on? So that analysis does a better job of predicting the risk. The implementation is not always flawless, and we're working with FEMA to fix some of that stuff, but the science is better. In addition, my parents, who have a house in Mexico Beach in the Florida Panhandle, and that's where Hurricane Michael hit, is in the X zone. But their house is 4 houses from the ocean in the X zone, has a higher risk than somebody with an X zone in Kansas. I don't want my parents to pay flood insurance or a higher flood insurance. I can't deny their risk is higher because the Hurricane Michael 14-foot wave that hit their house is not going to hit the Kansas house. So risk rating 2.0 corrects some of that inequity. It looks at replacement cost. It looks at distance to the ocean, distance to the river. So anyway, there's a lot of better data there. We're just working on the implementation. Now, I say all that to say, if the analysis gives us a risk of flooding for the ground, then the next piece of information we need is how high is your living space above the ground. So that's where this comes into play. The floor height above the constructed grade is what we need to rate that property. So FEMA estimates that the ground where your house is has a 86% chance of flooding or a 15% chance of flooding. And then when you say, well, my house is 6 feet above that, it allows us to adjust that risk of flooding to accommodate your height above the ground. So that's why we're looking at height above ground instead of height above the BFE now for the rating system. So sorry, that was a lot of information, but just enough to let you know why we're doing this new section. And it's floor height above constructed grade, which section E was natural grade. So it's a little bit of a change there. I don't think the insurance application was always quite as clean with the natural grade versus constructed. Probably didn't get filled out correctly anyway. But the constructed grade is the important piece here. Also, we have an H2 box. This is the machinery and equipment discount box. This is not based on compliance. The question here is not asking, is your machinery above the flood elevation? What it's asking is your machinery on the next higher floor? So we're looking at a discount. It's like 5% at the most. It's not a huge discount, but it's just saying, is your machinery safer by being at the next floor? Doesn't always work with some of the nuances of buildings, but it's the way the process is now. So how high is your floor above the ground, and is the machinery elevation at a specific spot? Keep in mind, this has no impact to your regulatory processes or your LOMAs or LOMRFs. Nothing in sections H and I can be used for compliance or to support a LOMA or LOMRF. And if the surveyor fills out section C, it overrides what the homeowner puts here anyway. So this cannot be used for regulatory purposes. And we added a lot of qualifiers in the instructions to make sure we didn't have a scenario where a homeowner would come to you and say, hey, I filled out section H and I, the insurance company accepted it, you community have to as well. So we've protected you from that unintended consequence with a lot of qualifiers in the text. Now, section G, this is the community section. As you'll see, one of the biggest changes here is it is no longer optional, it is recommended. And FEMA really wanted to make it mandatory, but this is as strong of language as they could get through the lawyers, I think. So recommended is really recommended. This is a floodplain management section for a form that's primary purpose is floodplain management, so you really should be using it. So just be aware of that. Also, we have several new fields. We have the G2B field, which G1 is where you say, as a community official, you filled out the form using an existing survey. G2A is where you're saying you filled out section E for the homeowner, and now G2B is you saying section H. So it's just adding a community checkbox for the new field of H and I. G3 is a way to acknowledge the fact that you're using section G to correct or change the form. So community officials, you can write in section G. It does not break the surveyor's seal. The form is designed for section G to be completed. And sometimes you need to update fields over time, Or maybe you found an error later that you didn't see when you first were reviewing the form. You've always been able to use section G to correct sections A and B and E, but there's never a spot here to flag that you've done it. So this new checkbox is adding that. We also have a new low floor elevation, which is for the lowest horizontal structural member. So we had one for the finished floor, the low floor, which might have been, C2A, C2B, where that's coming from. But the as-built lowest horizontal structural member was missing, which is a really critical piece of floodplain management compliance documentation. So that was a good addition here. And then G11 is the variance section. This has been added. FEMA is tired of you issuing variances and not doing it the right way, or even doing it, first of all, is not a great idea. But when you were doing it, you weren't actually following your own processes. So often I've seen variances issued where I saw one community that got hit hard by a hurricane on their city commission meeting say they issued a variance for a hotel because they've been here a long time. That is not an acceptable variance reason. There's a very specific process that you have to go through to verify that the variance meets legal requirements, and you weren't doing it. So now we have a checkbox here where if you're going to issue a variance, you have to justify it. You got to give me the documentation and the description and explain it. And the documentation is not my city commission approved it. It's, did you go through the process? Is the variance based on the property, not the person? It can't be based on costs. And there's a lot of requirements there in the variance process that you've got to document and attach to the EC if you're going to issue one. The easiest way to avoid this, don't issue variances in your floodplain management regulations. Now, one big thing to note is that G8, which is the new or substantial improvement box, and G11 are mandatory for CRS purposes. And this is creating some consternation because folks have been so used to ignoring section G that you're missing it. And under the review this year for ECs, the CRS reviewers hit this hard. So every EC, you've got to provide G8 and G11. And it can't just be supplemental information. You can't add the information in your permit spreadsheet. I tried that. It did not work. G8 and G11 have to be completed on the EC. So it's mandatory for CRS purposes every single time. So as I mentioned, we've got this comparison document, and if we have time, we'll go through it a little bit more, but you can download this. I updated it to the 2023 edition. Note here in this comparison document, anything that changed between the 2022 edition and the 2023 is highlighted in green because I want to make sure what little changes happened, and very little happened that changed, but that's highlighted. I mean, even to the fact of the footer, and that's one way, by the way, you can determine do you have the latest and greatest EC. Is the 2022 broken version in the bottom in the footer, it says 10/22, so October 2022. The new version, the 2023, actually says 8/23 in the footer of the form and the instructions, so August 23. So that's the easiest way to verify the form you're given is the latest and greatest version. And this is important because there were some errors in the 2022 edition, like you couldn't put text in some of the number fields. And we have surveyors who are still saying, well, I can't put NA because the fields won't let me. Yes, they can. You're using the old version of the form. So communities, that's a way for you to verify you've got the latest and greatest version is the footer will say 8/23 on the instructions and the form itself. So you can download this flfloods.org/resources and make sure you've got the latest and greatest version. And this is the one that improves, it has corrected functionality. Also, as I mentioned before, the download error here, it's in text on the screen, so nobody can say we didn't tell you. If you're trying to view it in a web browser, you will get that error message. If you get the error message, you are viewing it in a browser, period. All right, Emily, let's do a poll question to make sure folks are listening.
I'm going to jump in here. So I'm going to launch the poll now. Do you mind showcasing the answer choices?
Oh, yeah, sorry. I'll do that. So which field is new in the 2023 EC? Is it the A5 horizontal datum? Is it the A8C number of openings? Is it the B13 Limois, or is it G8 new or substantial improvement? Which is the new field?
So if you want to receive 1 hour CFM continuing education credit, please be sure to answer the poll question. The poll question should appear in a pop-up on the screen, but if you don't see that, be sure to check your chat, and then we'll just give a few moments just to review and answer the question.
All right, got a lot of different answers coming in. A little bit. You don't have to get it right to get credit. You just have to make sure you answer. We've only got, all right. Aaron, I'll let you decide when we close this down.
Okay, I'll just give it maybe another 20, 30 seconds.
A lot of folks are dropping their answers in the chat instead. I guess they're having some issues with the poll. Yeah, there's a lot of moving pieces in this new form, so there's a little bit of a trick question in these answers. Yeah, is it the horizontal datum? Is it the number of openings, Limois, or new or substantial improvement? Which one is the new field?
All right, I don't see any more answers trickling in, so I will close it up.
All right. So what's our results there?
So we had about 88% of people that responded using the poll functionality to be B13 Limois.
Okay. And then I see in the chat, we've got B13s, we have A5s, we had some G8s come in. So which is the new field? Well, it is B13, the Limois field. That is the brand new one. And yes, this was kind of a trick question because in A5, we have a new box, we have a new datum, which is the WS84. And in AC, the number of openings have been split into 2 separate fields. And then for G8, it is now mandatory for CRS. However, A5, A8C, and G8 are not new fields. They've just been tweaked a little bit. The only new field is or B13 of these choices is the brand new field. That's the limit of moderate wave action. So appreciate everybody jumping in and asking those questions. So we're gonna jump real quick into the GAFM EC tool and go through this for a few minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions on both the new EC and the guidebook. So we have the Georgia Association of Floodplain Managers EC guidebook that's coming out. Just a little bit of history for this guidebook. FEMA Region 4 pulled together a guidance document years ago that looked at building diagrams and a bunch of random, weird, unique buildings and what the corresponding building diagram would be. Because it's been a lot of consternation and confusion about selecting the building diagrams. However, this was so complicated that I think FEMA's version had about 30, 35 different buildings. They pulled together experts in Atlanta and got halfway through and quit because they couldn't agree because it was so confusing. Once you get down in the weeds, it's hard to determine the nuances. So once that was kind of put on a shelf, they didn't quit. They put it on a shelf to come back to. And GAFM, Georgia Association of Floodplain Management, grabbed it, took it off the shelf, and ran with it and started trying to make this a more robust document. And then GAFM actually applied to the ASFPM Foundation for funding to make this a tool. As I mentioned, ASFPM Foundation raises money to fund projects that impact floodplain management. And so this tool is one that it's been pushed by GAFM, but once we get it rolling, it's going to be accessible nationwide. And it's going to help folks understand which building diagram a certain building is and provide a lot of supporting documentation. And so ASFPM awarded the grant to my company, Schwalls Consulting, and Wes Shaw of Blue Urchin. So I'm I was almost about to say the brains, but I'm definitely not the brains of the operation. Wes is definitely the guy. So I'm the policy guy, the EC expert, and Wes is the website and the technology guy. So as we're designing this, we're designing an online tool. So it's going to be something where you actually enter, you answer questions, and then as you answer the questions, the options for building diagrams go away. So if you select something and the option for diagram 6 goes away, and you thought it was a 6, then it helps you understand that you did something wrong or you're misinterpreting the data. Now, I am pretty sure I'm developing a Porsche, and Wes is keeping me humble with a Honda. I mean, I'm running with scissors here, but it's going to be a really good tool. I'm excited about it. Just to give you a few examples, it's going to look at your standard buildings like this one, and these are some that are in a lot of the random FEMA publications, and to tell you exactly what it is, and then what fields have to be completed, and the relevant information. So is A8 relevant? Is A9 completed? Is C, which portions is C2? And then notes to the user. And some of this is background data that Wes is taking and rolling in. And so these are some of my codes that I've created. But what's the identifying feature? Does it have an enclosure? Does it not? And this has been delayed because we knew that FEMA's new form was coming out and it was going to be very different than the old form. And so we didn't want to create a new form or this tool and then have to redo everything to accommodate the new form. So that's kind of why it's been delayed. It was supposed to be out before COVID, but then we had to wait on FEMA's brand new form to come out, and so that got delayed and all. But yeah, so we've got these different versions of the diagram. We have one here, example 22, and we go through and talk about the nuances of the building and what makes it that diagram versus this one. So we're going to have these sketches in here, but also we're going to have diagram 5s. And so a lot of random ones, not just from the EC publications, but from some of the other guidance documents. But in addition, we've got real world examples. Here's a literal real building. What diagram is this? And we're adding these because a lot of these buildings get misunderstood as far as how they connect to the EC diagrams. But when you put a picture like this on the right, which historically has been called a diagram 1B with an attached garage, you take that and you put it next to a diagram 3, it's very clear these are the same building. But then if that's a diagram 3, we have to add the A8 information in the bottom floor, but the diagram doesn't have A8. So those kind of nuances of how we wrestle through the weird stuff of building diagrams. I've got one that's a diagram 7, and the enclosure below, which is a garage, is actually below the water because it's a boat garage. That's weird. That's not what a diagram 7 is supposed to be. But for that building, it's the closest thing we have. So wrestling through some of those nuances, like an open air parking garage, not really what a diagram 5 was intended for, but it's the closest thing we have. So looking at a lot of those nuances, it'll be an online tool. We're trying to get it rolled out by the end of the year, and as far as a draft version, and then going to get Wes to really make it as a robust online tool, maybe have an app eventually at some point, and really hoping to roll it out by the ASFPM National Conference in New Orleans come, May? Yeah, in May. And so this tool is coming out, really excited about it. But here's my contact information. If you got any questions, you can reach out to me. And we will now open it up to questions in general, Erin and Emily.
Thank you, Dill. I do appreciate that. Just kind of quickly, could you explain
Emily,
a little bit?
You want to turn on your camera so I'm not alone?
You're
Maybe
not
join me.
alone.
There we go. Okay.
You're never alone, Dill. No, could you kind of explain a bit more about the section G that's mandatory for CRS, and how communities are supposed to complete that? Because I saw something recently where people are having a problem. They get that PDF and it's locked. How are they supposed to go in there and fix that?
Yeah, so that's one of the problems. So when the 2022 version of the form came out, when you signed and sealed Section D, it locked the entire form. So it locked Section G, which was a problem because it was now mandatory for CRS. So when FEMA fixed it with the 2023 version, their fix actually created an unintended consequence. So FEMA made it so that when you sign and seal Section D, it only locks C and D. So it doesn't lock Section G. But it left A and B open, which surveyors were not okay with because that's got some liability and there's no way to track who changed it or if it got changed once it's signed and sealed. And there's been back and forth about, well, is it that big of a deal? We don't think so. The surveyors are very adamant that it's a big deal. And as an engineer, I can do ECs in Florida. I'm not going to sign and seal an EC where A and B is left open. So what surveyors have done instead is fill it out, print it, and then lock the whole document again, which I can't blame them because of the liability issue. But what that does is that makes a locked Section G for a digitally signed and sealed. So we're back to the same problem we had before. So how do you actually fill out Section G? Well, been going back and forth with FEMA and CRS on this, on the best way to do it. Like I said, I originally recommended we just add it to the permit spreadsheet. They said no. One workaround that we've created, and if you noticed, yesterday, CRS sent out a brand new correction memo. That came about because I was reviewing ECs in Jacksonville, and I used the correction memo to correct sections G8 and G11 and got pushback. And so working with CRS, like, is it valid to use the correction memo to fix section G8 and G11? And we got FEMA to kind of weigh in, and they said, yeah, you know what? Actually, it is. So that's why that new correction memo came out and includes some other pieces. So that's a workaround. But if you've got 400 ECs, doing that for 400 properties is a little bit of a hassle for sure. So one thing we've been recommending is for G8, which is new or substantial improvement. Most surveyors are aware, is this a brand new building or substantial improvement? I mean, it's not hard to figure that out when you do an EC. Or for G11, has a variance been issued? If the surveyor is part of the construction process at all, that is a pretty understandable, answer. And, working with the community. So what we've been suggesting to the communities and the surveyors is for the surveyors to complete, check the box in G8 and G11 for the community so that it's finished when it gets to them. Now, some communities have pushed back and said, no, we don't like the surveyors filling out our section. But 99 out of 100 times, it's new construction and a variance has not been completed. So it's not a perfect solution. It's what I've been talking to my surveyors and communities about in Florida and the trainings I teach. It's a little messy, but I don't know another way to do it before it gets there. So I don't know. We've asked FEMA to revise the form so that signing and sealing D locks A, B, and C. We haven't had any progress on that for a while. So I know that's a non-answer, but it's the best I got.
No, I appreciate you mentioning all of that because that is very important for our CRS communities. We do have a few other questions in the chat, but we're running short on time. So if you don't mind, Dell, I'm gonna get folks to go ahead and enter in their name and email in the chat that are looking for CECs for today's session. And while you and I talk a little bit more about some of these questions, is there a standardized form for issuing a variance? My particular situation involves the paving of a short extension of a driveway.
I haven't seen a standard form, and it's actually something that's come up in Florida. For the Florida Floodplain Managers Association, we've got a couple of building officials on our board of directors, and we've actually asked them to take a stab at writing up a one-page variance form because I haven't seen one. Because our communities want, can you give me something that gives guidance on this? Now, the problem with that is that based on state law, the variance procedures can be a little more strict. I mean, FEMA has the bare minimum, but then you might have some more strict ones. So threading that needle is a little difficult. But there's standard language in the FEMA regulations and in your local ordinances for variance procedures. So no, there's not a standard one unless somebody else has one that they're aware of. I haven't seen one yet, but the Florida Floodplain Managers Association is working on one, and we will of course share it with our sister chapters once we get, if and when we get there.
Great. Another question came up. Are surveyors in general aware of the new certificate changes that you went over?
Some are. It's hit or miss. I taught this class at this Alabama surveying conference last fall, and about half were and half weren't. Half of them didn't even know there was a brand new form that had come out, much less the changes. And so that comparison document I have at flfloods.org, you can share that with anybody and everybody. I've tried to do my best at going through and putting every single nuance, every single change that's in there. I've had it reviewed a few times with people and nobody's found anything missing yet. But yeah, cast it to the wind. If somebody wants to know what's changed, it's in there. I have no qualms about it being sent to anybody and everybody. I spent way too many weekend hours on that thing for it to sit on a shelf. So please use it.
I could certainly appreciate that. I want to thank everybody for putting their name and email in the chat if they're looking for continuing education credits. Just to remind everyone, our next Lunch and Learn series will be on November 6th from 12 to 1, where we'll have 3 communities discuss some of their best management practices. The chat's going to stay open for a few more minutes, so if you've got any other questions, throw them on in there, and we'll try and get back in touch with you, but be sure to put your email with your question so that we can follow up with you. Also, if you've noticed on the screen, there is a link to the survey, as was mentioned at the top of the hour. Please, please, please fill out the survey so that we can improve these webinars. And there's also a code for signing up for our next Lunch and Learn, but if you don't get that, don't worry. We'll be also sending out those email invites. But for now, this ends our Lunch and Learn for today. Thank you so much for your time, Dell.
Hey, Emily, one other thing to mention too, with the new correction memo that came out from CRS yesterday, I've had some people say, it's a 2-page correction memo, whereas before we had a 1-pager. And so I've had people ask, is there a 1-page version? And so I actually created a 1-page correction memo with the new information, and that kind of generated this change a little bit. It's got the same data as the CRS version, and CRS doesn't require you use their version. They just require you, that's an example to use.
Okay.
So I'm going to actually add my correction memo I created and put it on the FL Floods website as well. Like I said, it's a 1-pager. It's got the address field at the top instead of in A2, because I always think if I'm going to I have to put the address on there, but if I put it in A2, it looks like I'm correcting the address. So it's got a little nuances to it. So I'll put that on there. People can use as well. You can use CRS's, you can use mine, whichever's fine. But I make no guarantee that mine's perfect. It's just the version I've been using for communities, and it's made it through several CRS reviews. So anyway, if that's a helpful resource, it'll be out there.
Fantastic. We did have one last question. Section E, if there's a BFE, does this page need to be completed?
Well, maybe. So if it's a zone A with a BFE, then no. If you complete section C with a BFE, then it's not required. However, for a zone AO, if you have a local BFE, it doesn't matter. A zone AO, section E is always mandatory regardless of your local flood studies. So a lot of people, if there's a M.A.P zone AO, they might have a local study with a BFE. And so you want section C completed, you still have to do section E for FEMA compliance.
Fantastic. Loretta, I see you've got your hand raised. You still with us, Loretta? maybe. Okay.
Oh, it's a mistake,
Oh.
she said.
Okay. I understand. Yeah, I recently had upgrades to software myself, so I'm still trying to figure out where did it go.
Yeah, when I've used GoToMeeting and GoToWebinar for all my trainings I've taught over the last 10 years, and now I got rid of those, so I have to figure out Team for my next class, and I am not happy.
I can understand. Appreciate that too. All right. Well, thank you again, everyone. And if you have anything else that you need to have answers for, just shoot me an email and we'll follow up.